July 10, 1943, southeast of Kursk, Soviet Union. Major Friedrich Weber grips the metal hatch of his Tiger tank, knuckles pale against the scorched steel. Through the viewing slit, he watches a scene that defies everything he learned at the Panzer training grounds. Smoke transforms the Russian steppe into a hellscape. Not the smoke of Soviet defeats. The smoke of burning German armor. His battalion rolled into Operation Citadel 6 days ago with 48 tanks. This morning's count, 19 still mobile. The rest, scattered across these fields like broken toys. Some destroyed by Soviet guns. Most abandoned, engines seized, transmissions shattered, fuel lines bleeding. The brand new Panthers they were promised would win this war lie scattered behind them. Mechanical corpses cooking under the July sun before a single Soviet shell found them. Weber's gunner, Schmidt, a man who fought through Poland, France, and 2 Russian winters, speaks without turning from his sight. Herr Major, I think we're witnessing something historians will write about. The day the Wehrmacht ran out of miracles. Weber doesn't respond. He's counting Soviet tanks on the horizon, not dozens, hundreds. Wave after wave emerging from defensive positions intelligence swore didn't exist. 8 defensive lines deep, minefields stretching to the horizon, artillery pre-sighted on every German approach route, anti-tank guns positioned with mathematical precision. This isn't the Soviet army of 1941 that crumbled before them. This is something new, something terrifying, an enemy that learned from every defeat, adapted every tactic, and now waits with the patience of a predator that knows its prey is already wounded. Orders, sir? Schmidt asks. Weber studies the battlefield. Soviet tanks advancing through their own minefields like they own the geography. German infantry pinned in villages they can't clear. Air support that materialized for one glorious morning and then vanished as fuel trucks failed to reach the airfields. We hold this ridge, Weber says quietly. And when I say we're witnessing history, I don't mean German victory. I mean German extinction. On this front, at least. This is the story of July 10, 1943, the day German commanders realized Kursk wasn't a battle they were losing. It was the offensive that would shatter the myth of German invincibility forever, the last time Germany would have the strength to attack. From this moment, every step would be backward. Every battle defensive. Every day one step closer to the end. The shadow of Stalingrad to understand how Germany arrived at this catastrophic moment. You must understand what came before. Winter, 1942-1943, Stalingrad, a name that would haunt German military planning forever. 300,000 men encircled, frozen, starved, and destroyed. An entire field army erased from existence, not retreated, not transferred, annihilated. For ordinary Germans listening to radio broadcasts that suddenly stopped mentioning the 6th Army, the silence spoke volumes. For the Wehrmacht High Command, the implications were worse. Stalingrad had torn a 500-kilometer hole in the Eastern Front. Soviet armies poured through that gap like floodwater through a broken dam, threatening to cut off and destroy entire army groups. Only desperate fighting through the killing cold of January and February prevented total collapse. Field Marshal von Manstein performed near miracles of defensive warfare, using mobile armored formations to strike Soviet spearheads, buying time, preventing encirclements. By spring 1943, the front stabilized, but stabilization is not victory. Germany had burned through its reserves. Equipment losses staggered the imagination. Tank factories couldn't replace what Stalingrad consumed. Infantry divisions existed on paper, but fielded half their authorized strength. Veteran NCOs who formed the backbone of the army lay frozen in Russian fields. Something had to change. Hitler and the High Command agreed on that. What they couldn't agree on was whether to stand on the defensive or try one more offensive, to reclaim the initiative, the Optimist won. Look at a situation map from April 1943. One feature dominates. The Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines approximately 250 kilometers wide, jutting westward toward German positions. A tempting target. If German forces struck simultaneously from north and south, they could pinch off the bulge, encircle perhaps 5 Soviet armies, eliminate 500,000 men in one strategic masterstroke. On paper, brilliant. In execution, doomed. The problems were obvious to anyone willing to see them. The predictable trap. First, predictability. The Kursk salient was the most obvious target on the entire Eastern Front. A geography student could see it. Soviet intelligence didn't need sophisticated analysis to predict German intentions. They had something better. Spies. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park read German communications like morning newspapers and passed everything to Moscow. Soviet spy networks in Switzerland fed detailed intelligence directly to Stalin's desk. German officers talked in restaurants and bars, and Soviet agents listened. By early May, Marshal Georgy Zhukov knew Operation Citadel was coming. He knew the objectives. He knew the approximate timing. He knew which German units would lead the attack, and he had months to prepare. While German planners debated and delayed, Soviet forces transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress that made the Maginot Line look like a garden fence. 300,000 civilian laborers worked alongside military engineers. They dug and dug, and dug out 8 successive defensive belts, each subdivided into zones, trenches deep enough to stand in, bunkers reinforced with steel and timber, anti-tank ditches wide enough to swallow a tiger. Over 1 million mines, anti-tank and anti-personnel, methodically placed to channel German advances into killing zones. 20,000 artillery pieces positioned for overlapping fields of fire. 3,000 tanks held in reserve, hidden in forests and behind ridges, waiting for the moment to counterattack. Pre-registered artillery coordinates on every logical German approach route. Infantry positioned in mutually supporting strongpoints. The Germans were about to drive an armored spearhead into a buzzsaw. Second problem, delays. Originally scheduled for early May, Citadel was postponed, and postponed again. And again, why? Hitler insisted on waiting for new wonder weapons. The Panther tank designed to counter the Soviet T-34, the Ferdinand tank destroyer, mounting an 88mm gun behind thick armor, the Tiger tank, already proving formidable in small numbers, but production remained painfully slow. Every week of delay gave the Soviets more time to fortify, more time to bring in reserves, more time to position anti-tank guns, more time to lay mines. German field commanders begged to launch in May while mud still hampered Soviet reinforcements. Hitler refused. He wanted his new tanks. He wanted overwhelming technological superiority to compensate for what everyone privately acknowledged: numerical inferiority. By the time Operation Citadel finally launched on July 5th, the delay had become catastrophic. Those new Panthers rushed from factories with oil still dripping from their transmissions, undertested, unreliable, prone to mechanical failures that left them burning without enemy action. Third problem, resources. The Eastern Front stretched over 2,000 kilometers. Concentrating enough force to break through at Kursk meant stripping other sectors to dangerous thinness. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, privately warned that even if Citadel succeeded, Germany lacked reserves to exploit the breakthrough. The best-case scenario? A tactical victory with no strategic impact. Worst case? Catastrophic losses for no gain, but political necessity overrode military reality. Germany needed a victory. Allies were wavering. Italy looked ready to collapse. Public morale sagged under the weight of Stalingrad's shadow. The offensive would proceed. The storm breaks July 5, 1943. 3 km German artillery opened fire across the entire front. Thousands of guns roaring in unison. A steel storm intended to pulverize Soviet forward positions. Infantry and armor massed behind the barrage, ready to exploit the breakthrough. What they didn't know, Soviet intelligence had predicted the exact time of attack. 30 minutes before German artillery fired, Soviet guns unleashed their own barrage, striking German assembly areas, communication centers, and supply dumps. The surprise was ruined before the first German tank moved. Northern sector. General Walter Model's 9th Army attacked with 335,000 men and 1,200 tanks. Their objective: drive south toward Kursk, link up with forces attacking from the south, close the trap. Progress: 6 kilometers on day 1. Against fanatical resistance, against prepared positions, against mines that destroyed tanks before they reached the enemy, against anti-tank guns positioned for interlocking fields of fire. Those brand new Panthers, of 200 committed to the northern attack, only 40 remained operational by evening. The rest mechanical failures, thrown tracks, overheated engines, transmission breakdowns. Some caught fire simply moving into position. The Tiger tanks performed better, their thick armor shrugging off most Soviet anti-tank rounds. But there were too few Tigers and too many Soviet guns, and the Ferdinands, the tank destroyers Hitler pinned such hopes on, proved vulnerable to close-range infantry attack. No machine guns for self-defense. Too heavy to recover if damaged. Crews abandoned them rather than risk being burned alive. Southern Sector. Field Marshal von Manstein's forces did better. 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf attacked with 349,000 men and 1,500 tanks. They achieved deeper penetration, breaking through the first Soviet defensive belt, pushing toward the town of Oboyan. But better is relative. Casualties were horrific. Every kilometer cost hundreds of men and dozens of tanks. Soviet defenders fought with a stubbornness German veterans had never encountered. Individual positions held until physically overrun. Artillery fire never slackened. Reserves appeared seemingly from nowhere to plug gaps in the line. By July 9th, 4 days into the offensive, reality became inescapable. The illusion shatters northern attack. Stalled. Model's forces had penetrated 15 kilometers in 4 days, nowhere near the breakthrough required. Casualties 25,000 men over 200 tanks. The 9th Army was fought out, incapable of continuing. Southern attack, better progress but still insufficient. Von Manstein's forces penetrated 35 kilometers, but this was measured against a defensive system 40 kilometers deep. 4th Panzer Army reported over 300 tanks destroyed. SS Panzer Corps, elite units with Tiger tanks, reported 50% casualties in some battalions. For the first time in the war, German armored forces were being ground down in attrition warfare. This was supposed to be impossible. German doctrine emphasized mobility, concentration of force, rapid exploitation. Grinding attrition battles were what happened when operations failed. Citadel was failing. German tank commanders could see this clearly. They were the ones sitting in steel boxes, watching comrades burn, seeing platoons reduced to handfuls of survivors. Oberstleutnant Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, one of Germany's most decorated tank commanders, visited a field hospital on July 9th. A young tanker, face wrapped in bandages, asked when they would break through. Strachwitz looked at the boy and couldn't lie. "We won't. This offensive is finished. We just haven't admitted it yet." That realization spread through German armored formations like infection. Experienced officers who had fought across Europe recognized what they were seeing. This wasn't temporary resistance that would crack under pressure. This was a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The Soviets had learned to fight. They had the equipment, the tactics, the will to trade blow for blow with German armor. And they had more. More tanks, more artillery, more men, more everything. Prokhorovka, the funeral of German armor, July 12th. 1943, near the village of Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle in history erupted. Von Manstein's southern thrust had pushed deep enough to threaten Soviet reserves. Marshal Zhukov committed the 5th Guards Tank Army, over 800 tanks, to stop the advance. What followed was apocalyptic. 1,500 armored vehicles engaged across a relatively confined battlefield. Soviet T-34s, knowing their armor couldn't stop German guns at range, closed to point-blank distance where their own weapons could penetrate. German Tigers and Panthers, designed for long-range engagements, found themselves in knife-fighting range where advantages evaporated. Tanks rammed each other. Crews bailed out and fought with small arms. Artillery fire fell indiscriminately. Infantry with anti-tank rifles targeted vision ports and track assemblies. The air filled with smoke so thick commanders couldn't distinguish friend from enemy. The battle raged 12 hours. When silence finally fell, the battlefield was a graveyard. Burning wrecks stretched to the horizon. Soviet losses approximately 300 to 400 tanks. Heavy, painful. But the 5th Guards Tank Army accomplished its mission. The German advance stopped. Von Manstein's forces couldn't continue. They had reached the limit of capability. German tank commanders experienced something unprecedented at Prokhorovka. For 2 years they had been the elite, the spearhead, confident in training and equipment. Now they fought for survival against Soviet tankers who showed neither fear nor hesitation. The psychological impact was devastating. German armored units would never again have the same confidence, the same belief in invincibility. They would continue fighting, often brilliantly, but always with the knowledge that they were outnumbered, outproduced, and ultimately doomed. The decision, July 13th, 1943, 8 days into Operation Citadel, Hitler officially canceled the offensive. The official reason: Allied landings in Sicily required redeployment of forces to Italy. The real reason: Citadel had failed. The offensive gained some ground in the south, but nothing strategically significant. The Kursk salient remained in Soviet hands. The price Germany paid for this failure was catastrophic. German casualties: approximately 54,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Tank losses: 1,500 vehicles. These weren't just machines. They represented the core of German armored strength. The Panthers and Tigers rushed into service to restore technological superiority, had proven mechanically unreliable and vulnerable to Soviet tactics. Production couldn't replace these losses quickly enough. More devastating, the loss of experienced crews. Tank commanders, gunners, drivers who had survived years of combat were killed at Kursk. Their replacements were hastily trained recruits, lacking the skill of veterans. The quality of German armored forces would never recover. Soviet casualties were higher in absolute numbers, perhaps 300,000 casualties, over 1,500 tanks destroyed. But the Soviets could afford these losses. Soviet factories produced thousands of tanks monthly. The Red Army trained millions of soldiers. The Soviet Union had a population 3 times Germany's and an industrial base beyond German reach. More importantly, the Soviets proved something at Kursk. They proved they could defeat the best Germany could deploy, not through luck or weather or logistics, but through superior preparation, tactics, and overwhelming material strength. The long retreat begins. German commanders understood the implications immediately. If Germany couldn't win when concentrating all available forces for a carefully planned offensive, how could it possibly win the war? It couldn't. After Kursk, German strategy on the Eastern Front became purely defensive. No more grand offensives. No more attempts to knock the Soviet Union out of the war. From July 1943 onward, German forces would fight a long, brutal retreat, conducting defensive battles, launching limited counterattacks, but always inevitably losing ground. Some commanders recognized this immediately. Others clung to beliefs in negotiated peace, in miracles that would save the Reich. But the tank commanders who fought at Kursk knew better. Major Otto Carius, a Tiger commander who fought in the southern sector, later wrote about July 10th as the day he stopped believing Germany could win. Not because of one dramatic moment, but 1,000 small observations. Soviet tanks that kept coming regardless of losses. Artillery fire that never ceased. Mines that destroyed vehicles before they reached the front. Mechanical breakdowns that left German tanks burning without enemy fire. The sheer crushing weight of Soviet material superiority. Carius wrote that he and his crew continued fighting because they were soldiers. Because retreat meant abandoning comrades. Because surrender meant Siberian prison camps. But they fought without hope of victory. Only hope of survival. That was Kursk's true cost for Germany. Not just tanks and men, but the death of belief. The realization that skill, courage, and tactical brilliance couldn't overcome fundamental material disadvantages. Soviet counteroffensives began immediately. On July 12th, Soviet forces launched attacks against the northern face of the German salient. On August 3rd, massive operations struck the southern face. These weren't limited counterattacks. These were offensive operations designed to drive Germans back hundreds of kilometers. They succeeded. By August 23rd, Soviet forces liberated Kharkov. By September, they pushed Germans across the Dnieper River. The Great German Retreat had begun. It would continue, with brief pauses for desperate defensive stands, until Soviet tanks reached Berlin in April 1945. German tank commanders watched this retreat with grim understanding. Every kilometer lost was ground never to be retaken. Every defensive position abandoned brought the war closer to Germany itself. The end was inevitable, but they couldn't say this aloud. Defeatism was punishable by execution, so they fought on. Manning tanks, training replacements, hoping to survive one more day, one more battle. The ripple effects. Kursk's impact extended beyond the Eastern Front. Germany's allies saw the writing on the wall. Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Finland all began seeking exit strategies. Italy collapsed in September when allies invaded the mainland. German forces had to occupy Italy, further weakening the Eastern Front. Germany's strategic position became untenable. Fighting the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States simultaneously, occupying most of Europe, defending against partisan movements in the Balkans, France, and Russia. This required resources Germany simply didn't have. Kursk shattered the illusion that German military skill could compensate for material disadvantages. It revealed the fundamental reality. Germany was fighting enemies with larger populations, economies, and industrial bases. As long as those enemies remained committed, Germany would eventually lose. The only question was how long the losing would take and how many would die before the end. The personal crisis. For tank commanders who fought at Kursk, July 10th represented a personal and professional crisis. These were men who built careers around armored warfare, who perfected tactics for breakthrough and exploitation, who achieved stunning victories across Europe. Now they fought a defensive war of attrition, exactly the warfare they trained to avoid. Their role changed from spearhead to fire brigade, rushing from crisis to crisis, plugging gaps, covering retreats. Necessary work, but the work of losers. Major Hans von Luck, the commander from our opening, survived Kursk and fought until war's end. Captured by Soviets in 1945, he spent 5 years in prison camps. In memoirs written decades later, he returned repeatedly to Kursk, to that moment on July 10th when he understood Germany had lost the war. He wrote that tactical details faded over time, but that crushing realization remained vivid forever. The final irony. The ultimate irony of Kursk, it was completely unnecessary. Germany gained nothing from the offensive. Even if Citadel had succeeded, even if German forces had encircled 5 Soviet armies, it wouldn't have changed the strategic situation. The Soviet Union would have replaced those armies within months. The war would have continued. All Germany did was squander irreplaceable forces on an operation with no chance of strategic victory. Some German generals recognized this before the offensive and argued against Citadel. But political leadership demanded action, demanded a victory to restore confidence and convince allies to remain committed. So the offensive proceeded. Germany's last mobile reserves were sacrificed in a battle that accomplished nothing except hastening defeat. July 10th, 1943. The day German tank commanders knew Kursk would break them. The day the German army's offensive capability died. The day the long retreat began. The day reality shattered the myth of invincibility and the beginning of the end.